I'll pause for a little bit. Hello, everybody. Welcome to PNP Live. I'm Beth Wong, and I work in events for Politics and Prose. We thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we're continuing to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the big green button below and purchase tonight's book on PNP's website. We are currently offering reduced shipping as an incentive, especially as our physical stores are closed and we need your online purchases in order to keep bringing you the programming PNP is known for. It's $5 flat fee for shipping. Tonight, as a really special treat, we have a conversation partner, Dara Lind, with Alina, author of No Justice in the Shadows. You can ask the author a question. Clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen, you can type your question in that box, and you can see the other questions that other viewers have asked tonight. You can vote for the ones you want to hear heard the most, or you can submit your own. Go ahead and start asking those questions as soon as you've got them. A reminder that unlike our in-person events, the author, host, and audience members cannot see you through the screen. We welcome you tonight. Come as you are, in your pajamas, in your work clothes, in your whatever. We're so happy you're here. On to the main event. In her important new book, No Justice in the Shadows, Alina, immigration rights activist, lawyer, and professor at NYU School of Law, shows that Trump's anti-immigration stand is only the latest, if most extreme, iteration of the idea of the criminal alien. Alina is joined tonight in conversation by Dara Lind, immigration reporter for ProPublica, former senior correspondent at Vox, and co-host of the podcast The Weeds. Welcome, Alina and Dara.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody who's out there. Alina, I wanted to, understanding that this is kind of a weird situation, obviously for you, not being, down here in DC, also that we're living through a time when it kind of seems like there is only one story that matters, and, working on a book that ostensibly isn't about that at all. But we've been talking over the last few days, and I know that in fact this, what you and your colleagues have been working on right now is a logical extension of the work you've been doing into the coronavirus era. And so, since so much of your book and one of the really things I really appreciated about it is how much it's grounded in the stories of your clients. Could you maybe kind of talk through the cases that you're working on right now and how the immigration system looks during a pandemic from the perspective of the people you're trying to reach?
Sure, and thank you so much, Dara, for being here, and thanks to Politics and Prose and to Bold Type Books and to all of you who I wish I could see, but can't right now. I really appreciate you taking a moment, especially during this horrific time, to be here and to hear us chat about some of the themes that this book covers. And sadly, I have to say that, when I started writing the book, I never imagined it would come out during a pandemic. I never imagined that our immigration system would quite look and feel the way it's looking and feeling right now, which is to say a lot because, I had a very low level of expectations for what we could see, particularly from the current administration when it comes to immigration policy. But I could never imagine things would be quite like this. And I have to say, sadly, the themes that I cover in the book are really more relevant than ever, given what we're hearing from the White House, from federal immigration agencies like ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the folks who are, going to people's homes and arresting people and really in charge of what folks call interior enforcement, as well as CBP and Border Patrol, CBP being Customs and Border Protection, who are really the ones at the border. And we're seeing a lot of horrific changes happening there now too. And I guess the ways that I think the book is particularly relevant and what I'm seeing in the cases of clients and people I care very deeply about being affected by current policies under COVID-19 and this pandemic is the way in which the federal government's policy right now is to essentially devalue human life in the name of public safety. And it's something that really angers me because my clients and the people that I've had the privilege of working with and for many years, they are members of the public, right? So they live in our communities. They were living their lives just fine before ICE came knocking on their door in the early morning hours to take them away. They were the ones who were dropping their kids off at school when ICE would come in. And this public safety rhetoric, this defense of these actions is really what prompted me to write the book in the first place. To see the way in which, you can keep over 30,000 people locked up in jails, knowing that they are at such heightened risk for contracting a deadly disease, and claim it's because of public safety when this is a civil immigration system. People are being held because they lack paperwork that we made a choice for very bad reasons, as I discuss in the book, to essentially criminalize and to require when we never needed to do that in the first place. So I think that the behavior of the government right now is shameful on so many different levels, and immigrants are really taking the hit, including many of my clients.
Can we talk about Usman's one?
Yes, we can. So Usman Darboe is a 26-year-old husband and father. I had the privilege of meeting him through his longtime immigration lawyer, Sophia Garule from the Bronx Defenders, who has been representing him for a number of years. And she brought in my clinic. I teach the Immigrant Rights Clinic at NYU Law School. And she brought in my clinic and my students to represent Usman to try and get him out of detention. And I have to say, his case exemplifies so much of what's wrong with this system. There's a great profile of Usman's case on Vox that really talks about how he ended up facing deportation as part of the school to prison pipeline. He came to the United States when he was just 6 years old. He ended up growing up in the Bronx with his family. He was in the poorest congressional district in the country. And he quickly found himself being turned from an honor student into somebody who was getting kicked out of school and harassed by police in his neighborhood as a Black man. He's an immigrant from the Gambia. And so it didn't take long before he ended up getting some juvenile offenses, and that was his entry point into the criminal legal system and part of this pipeline. But he served his time and he changed his life and he was ready to move on. But because of the way our immigration law works, instead of being able to get that second chance that he earned, he was thrust into a new pipeline, and that's the deportation pipeline. And that's where he remains today. I decided to write this book in 2017 in the summer. And actually that same month is when ICE took him. Today is day 995 of his detention. Our government has been locking up this man for that long. And what's more outrageous about his case is that, 5 days after he was initially locked up by ICE, he found out that his partner, a US citizen who lives in the Bronx, was pregnant with their first child. And even though ICE had the discretion to release him, they refused. And that little girl has grown up. She just had her second birthday earlier this month. She's grown up her entire life without having her dad by her side. That's what the immigration policies are, and to make matters worse, we did have a moment where we thought the tide would turn earlier this year, thanks to incredible advocacy by his family, by, his community in New York, by the Bronx Defenders, by others. Governor Cuomo actually granted Usman one of his very rare pardons. So in February of this year, that conviction, his only adult conviction that Usman has received was for an unarmed robbery, for which he maintained his innocence but took a plea deal to get out of Rikers as a young man. That happened a very long time ago, and Governor Cuomo listened and he pardoned Usman. And we thought that was it. We thought we could go to ICE and ICE would finally say, oh, you're right. We've been keeping him locked up because of this. We don't have to. We're going to let him go. He's been pardoned. And they didn't care. They gave us a one-page decision saying that they were going to continue to lock him up because of his conviction without even mentioning the fact that it had been pardoned. I mean, that's the kind of bureaucracy he's stuck in. And before people say, well, if you're an immigrant, that's what you get, I think the important thing to remember, again, is that he's somebody who did what was expected of him. He changed his life. And it's not just him, it's his entire family. It's his wife and his child who are suffering because of what our government is doing to him. And the fact that even today, with a pandemic, despite our requests for his release, he's sitting in Bergen County Jail, which is the epicenter for the COVID-19 cases, the first place in the country that had a positive COVID-19 case among people held by ICE. He remains there. And thus far, neither ICE nor the courts have been willing to release him. Thankfully, we're going to keep fighting. A shout out to my students, Amy Joseph and Cynthia Lee, who have been litigating this nonstop with Sophia and myself over the last several months. We're going to keep fighting until someone listens, but it shouldn't have to be this hard. And his life is worth far more than what our government is doing to him. It's a real travesty of justice.
The thing about, Usman's story, or, it, for that matter, many of the cases that you talk through in the book, is that it really, once you start recognizing the same kind of themes and motifs in the history of immigration enforcement, stuff just keeps coming up. Like, listening to you, I'm thinking about some of the stuff you have in the book about the push-pull between state and local laws getting made to criminalize immigrants, and then sometimes, and the federal government kind of following suit, or conversely, trying to reduce the extent to which state and local governments can claw back. But something else that's predominant in the book is kind of a history of accidents where the same system that ends up incurring these consequences for someone then realizes that it didn't necessarily mean to do all of that collateral damage and tries to kind of claw it back. Is that, to what extent do you see this as a history of intentional harm versus a history of kind of tragic neglect?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a little bit of both, and it depends on what actors you're looking at. So, really the point of my book overall is to say that we've been looking at immigration policy and, approaching this debate in the wrong way. The title of the book is No Justice in the Shadows. And part of the reason I decided to call it that is because, we're constantly being told, even by folks who are part of progressive movements, people who don't like the consequences, who realize that it's too harsh. We're constantly being told that, what we need to be doing is making sure that that certain immigrants can come out of the shadows, and debating who those immigrants are, who deserves to come out of the shadows. When in reality, I think the question we should be asking, and the question that history teaches us to ask, is why those shadows exist in the first place. And with respect to that question, it is absolutely intentional. So if you go back into the history of our immigration system, when we started creating federal laws around immigration to begin with, that whole project is very much tied up with projects of anti-Blackness, of colonialism, of really the way we treat people of color and indigenous people, and how immigrants got placed into that hierarchy. And so you see the first federal laws, these choices that we're making that are intentional, come up during a time where, the borders of the United States were changing. Chinese immigrants were coming in, initially welcome for their labor, and then during an economic downturn become demonized. And very quickly, we have this very racialized criminalization. A lot of people are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act being one of the very first federal immigration laws. Again, going back to that intentional choice. But even earlier than that was something I talk about in the book, a law in 1875 called the Page Act, which specifically, before they were testing the waters, instead of going full-throatedly out against Chinese immigrants, they talked about barring convicts and prostitutes. They used language that anti-immigrant folks out in California had really adopted as ways of trying to drive Chinese people out and playing on those stereotypes. And so this is a constant theme in the book, that from the history, we see that, immigrants, like it really starts when immigrants are being associated with criminality. It's like a rhetoric. And then you actually see laws that criminalize behavior. This is true of drug laws. It's true of our border. There were a time where some of the acts that we criminalize today were not considered criminal acts. But when they got associated with people of color and with immigrants, that's where we start seeing laws that treated these as crimes. And then once you have a group of people who are both quote unquote criminal and quote unquote alien, you suddenly have this category that starts to justify a huge deportation machinery. And then that cycles right back into the rhetoric. And so we see that cycle throughout history until today, which is very intentional. At the same time, we see groups, like you mentioned, who can kind of step back and look at pieces of this machinery and recognize that there's a wrong. And, thanks to the work of incredible activists and scholars and others, journalists, we have a much better understanding, for example, of the horrors and the real racist foundations of our criminal legal system. And so there's a much better conversation. It's certainly by no means perfect, but a much better conversation that we're having today about the unintended and intended consequences of the criminal legal system and how we're supposed to be dealing with that as a policy, which is really wonderful and gratifying to hear. But yet sometimes when we push just a little bit further and we say, okay, well, we can recognize that, every arrest, like every police encounter, arrest, charge, conviction, sentence in our criminal legal system is racially charged, that there is a discriminatory element that runs throughout the entirety of the criminal legal system. Somehow we have that conversation about deportation, it stops, and people assume that, well, if you've been arrested or if you have a conviction and you're an immigrant, of course somebody has to be deported, so why not you? When the reality is that, we shouldn't be questioning who deserves deportation, who doesn't deserve deportation. We really should be asking, why are we deporting people? Because deportation itself is such a harsh consequence for something that, again, you roll back the history, was a choice that we made about paperwork, during a time where we were a lot more open about the fact that as a country we were being racist.
Yeah, I admit that this is one of the episodes in the book that I had no idea about. It was the first time the Supreme Court kind of took up the question of whether it was cool to deport, the Chinese immigrants who had already been, the Chinese immigrants who had already settled in the U.S. before the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the extent to which, only after the policy of deportation arose did the court consider the question of, is it actually the same thing to say that someone can't come here and to say that if you've been living in the U.S., we can kick you out? It is, it's a reminder of just how so much of this system has kind of been making potentiality more likely through more aggressive enforcement that then lead to places that the initial law didn't necessarily contemplate. I was hoping you could actually talk a little bit more about the dynamic of criminalization and the way that kind of ideas and rhetoric feed into law, because that's really one of the main engines driving the narrative of your book. And it can be a little bit, I think if you have the basic 101 level understanding of the history of U.S. immigration law, there used to be an explicit national quota system where, if you were an immigrant from Southern or Eastern Europe, much less anywhere else in the world, you weren't going to be able to get in. And the 1965 INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, ended up opening up immigration to a lot of people and did abolish this kind of facially national origins-based, facially racist system. So when we talk about, or when you talk in the book about the persistence of the racist roots of the pre-65 system, that can be a little bit more complicated because it is, something, it is a different dynamic coming from a different place in the law than we are going to make this system based on, we are going to determine who can come in based on the countries that we think can assimilate to us best.
Yeah, so I think, and it's clear that, and this again gets into the intentional, unintentional dynamic here. It's clear that changes that were brought in 1965, that was righting a set of wrongs, right? So, eliminating the national origins quotas was a huge step forward in terms of recognizing, at least on its face, that our immigration law should not be based on like where people came from. And other scholars who I talk about in the book have done an amazing job of really showing how much those national origins quotas were about race specifically, and really defining a white race and what that means to be American. And I think there's a whole history of that. Your proximity to whiteness as an immigrant, it wasn't a static definition. It's changed over time, but it's always been a defining feature of whether or not you could get those papers, whether you could come here and belong. And it's something we feel, currently today. So getting rid of those quotas was a huge deal. But it's no surprise, and that's what I try and articulate in the book, that here we are all these years later, and we now have more deportations, more imprisonment, more exclusions than we ever had previously, that the system has only grown. And there are very specific forces, openly white supremacist forces, including the legacy of someone named John Tanton, who has, formulated a number of organizations over the years that have tried to promote this idea of like, okay, well, now we have this system, we have to make it fair, lower immigration, protect Americans, doing it in ways that are very coded racially, but not as explicit. There's a whole system out there that is designed to make Americans believe that now our immigration system is just based on questions of what is good for the country versus what is not, as opposed to being a system that is designed to now keep out immigrants of color in different ways now that we don't have national origins quotas. And so there's a chapter in my book where I talk about a man named Lefty Lee, who's actually my first client as a lawyer, well, really as a law student, back when I first started in this work. And I talk about the fact that, it's no accident that he and his family came to New York and came to the United States in the early 1970s from Hong Kong. Had he tried to come any earlier, he would have been facing these barriers and these quotas preventing him from being here. So it's no accident he came then. But it's also no accident that by the mid 1990s, he found himself locked up in an immigration jail facing deportation, even though he was a green card holder, even though he had lived, his entire life and had by that point become a grandfather. He was facing deportation in the late 1990s. We basically used the criminal legal system and the mass incarceration system that grew in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as a response to civil rights reforms, including the immigration reforms. We've created a system that has penalized immigrants in different ways, that have used different threat narratives to talk about the same people now that we don't, most of us, I guess now the president still does use openly racist rhetoric to talk about immigrants. But, for the most part, many Americans don't use that rhetoric now, and we justify the current system because we're able to use this colorblind language to talk about immigration policy, when in fact we are simply targeting the same people now that there aren't quotas to prevent that wall. We're now building different walls, both the walls at the border and prison walls as well.
Maybe to give a little bit more specificity to that, and maybe to commit like a little bit of policy upon everybody listening. Maybe we could talk through the concept of moral turpitude some, because it's one of those where like people who aren't immigration nerds are usually wildly surprised at how important a phrase that sounds like it's out of a 1920s tract in immigration law.
Sure. So it's interesting because immigration law today now has long sections devoted to what types of criminal offenses might prevent you from coming to the U.S., from staying here, what can lead to someone being deported. And one of the things that I try to emphasize to people when I'm talking about this issue, again, is that really no one is immune, right? You can be a green card holder, you can have your lawful permanent residency, and then if you have a certain kind of conviction, you can be deported, and there's no statute of limitations. So it could be, a conviction you had, like a theft conviction you had when you were a teenager, and if it's considered an adult conviction, there you are, 20 years later, you're traveling back from visiting your grandma, and suddenly you're taken into an immigration jail. It happens every day, and it's a constant and expected part of the deportation system. So one of those categories is called a crime involving moral turpitude. And if you're wondering, what's a crime involving moral turpitude? Yes, I am too. I mean, after all of these years of litigating cases, of studying this, of teaching this course, it's still impossible for me to do anything but quote the variety of definitions that different agencies have given this term, because it really has no meaning. What I found really interesting about this term is that it came up, it was added to immigration law in the late 1800s, shortly after after Congress started, writing federal immigration law for the first time. And they didn't bother to define it then either. They just kind of said it, if you were convicted of this, then you could be excluded from coming into the United States. What's so interesting, and this is work that other scholars have done as well, is that this term also found its way into lots of different laws during that same time. And one of the places where it was first emerging was in laws that came out of the backlash to emancipation, that used moral turpitude as a reason to block people from being able to have the right to vote, the right to participate. Really, again, another example of how anti-Blackness and this idea of controlling free Black people also emphasized the way the federal government started responding to immigrants as well. And the idea was like, if we create a category that's kind of vague, that allows us to include things like vagrancy, like, petty theft, the kinds of crimes that Black people in particular were targeted for under Jim Crow laws, we create a category called crimes involving moral turpitude, then the people in power can decide when those categories apply, and they can enforce different laws based on that. So just like in voter suppression, we suddenly see this term popping up in our immigration law. And at that point in time, again, somebody who's familiar with the history, a person of privilege who never had to experience being targeted this way, will read a term like that and say, like, that makes sense. I don't want someone being here if they have committed a crime involving moral turpitude. That sounds bad. And once again, we have this growing division of our communities into good and bad immigrants, when in reality, it's just a tool, it's just a way of dividing and conquering, and really showing that we can use this wide discretion to target people of color and people who are least able to defend themselves in the system.
At one point, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that you don't think of this book as a book about the Trump administration. You think of it as a book after the person who comes after him. And I think I'm interested in hearing you elaborate a little more about that. But I'm also not sure that it's a fair description, because I think that when people hear that, it's very easy to imagine the kind of nonfiction book that is this sweeping, like, and now I'm going to teach immigration law in the last chapter of my book, and like lay out, a plan for like what a better system would look like. And instead, what you've done is, on one hand, point to the people within the the people in groups within the immigrant rights movement who have understood divisions between good and bad immigrants as false, and who have pressed for a more inclusive understanding, and kind of urged people who consider themselves part of that movement to adopt that more inclusive frame. But on the other hand, there's a lot of very, kind of tossed off, specific, even granular stuff in there, because there are so many points of intersection between the criminal justice system and the immigration system that are, ultimately things that a particularly motivated person could like adopt as a local agenda and make sure that their community is doing. So it does seem to a certain extent like you're writing for, maybe those who have been sensitized to the issue of immigration under the current era in a way they might not have been when some of these systems were set up to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I'm very privileged to work and live in a bit of a bubble, right? So, and I've told this to the people who've really been my teachers. Many organizing groups in New York City, like Families for Freedom, New Sanctuary Coalition, advocacy groups like the Immigrant Defense Project, and others. They have been saying this for a really long time, right? So we had a moment in the immigrant rights movement, a really big moment in 2006, when there was a bill, a Sensenbrenner bill, that was proposing criminalizing undocumented status, where we saw, thousands and thousands of people take to the streets in protest. And it was a beautiful moment, a really rich moment for immigrant rights organizing. But it was also a moment where a lot of people were out in the streets holding signs that said, "We are not criminals," right? And so my good friends at Families for Freedom and all these other organizations, people who have been facing deportation, who've lost loved ones because somebody had an old criminal conviction a long time ago, they were like, "Whoa, that is not the divide that we want to be making." Nor is it the kind of divide that we want to be making, given the fact that 1 in 3 Americans has had contact with the criminal legal system. This is not the way we want to divide up our people, because it's going to have a disproportionate impact on people of color and poor people and people, our loved ones, our family members. So since that time, even before that time, but that was a real watershed moment. For a decade, right? Organizing groups have been really pushing back and saying, okay, if you're part of the immigrant rights movement, please do not adopt a good versus bad immigrants narrative. It's only going to come back to hurt us, right? And there was tons of progress. I will say that a lot of organizations, recognize that we're coming up with more inclusive policies, and then Trump got elected, and it was a horrific thing, and people were incredibly scared, visceral reaction that people had, like living in their homes. Am I going to be able to come home and put my kids to bed today? It was a horrible moment. And the immigrant rights community really embraced this notion of inclusiveness. Like, we're all in the same boat. We all need to fight back. So all of that was great. And I never once thought during any of that time that I needed to write a book about the good versus bad immigrants myth. So what changed for me wasn't actually Trump, because as you mentioned, if anything, he brought more people into the fold, more people who never really thought about immigration policy, who didn't realize that President Obama had deported 3 million people. Like, a lot of people who were just not aware suddenly saw it because he was so obvious about what he was doing and why, that they realized it was a problem. So it wasn't because of him. I decided to write this book because I was literally sitting outside of City Hall in New York, listening to a presentation by members of Mayor de Blasio, a progressive New York City, our progressive New York City mayor, members of his administration, proposing to cut funding for legal defense for immigrants to immigrants who had certain criminal convictions. So during the rise in deportations under the Obama administration, New York City did a wonderful thing, and they decided to fund the country's first public defender system, the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project. And it was this incredible achievement that was due to the organizing by incredible groups here in the city to create this funding and ensure that any New Yorker who got locked up would get a lawyer. It's a basic right that our federal law does not recognize. So the city stepped in and said, we're going to do it. We're going to make it universal. And what does our New York City mayoral administration do in the era of Trump? They make a decision that some people who are deemed public safety threats because of their old records don't deserve to have a lawyer. And so I literally sat outside of the city council meeting talking to a friend of mine who was also an immigrant rights lawyer for an hour. And we just sat there saying, it's 2017. Why are we having this conversation in New York City? Why are we having this conversation about why public defense is important for everyone? Why there are certain basic rights that every individual deserves? Why it not only harms that individual, it harms the whole community if we allow people to go defenseless into deportation proceedings. And why are this language about public safety, why is this coming from somebody who is a progressive individual, a person who espouses values, who cares about immigrants, who cares about the criminal legal system. I mean, so it's at that moment that it became clear to me that that we needed to come to a baseline understanding of why dividing immigrants up into good and bad is racist, it's harmful, and it doesn't make us safer. And we needed that understanding to include some of those big picture policy ideas that will take a different precedent to implement, but also these really small kind of granular, concepts that a city, a county, a state can adopt. Because, doing something like universal legal defense, funding community-led, immigrant-led organizations who provide mutual aid to their communities, working with people to stop collaboration between your local government and ICE. These are policies that have been developed, and we need to not be rolling them back. We need to be pushing them forward. And so, in my solutions chapter, I do try and outline some of these changes to create a blueprint that different people can adopt. Because to be honest, my audience, it's certainly not the people who believe what Trump is doing is right. They're not the people that I'm trying to reach with this book. It's the people who want to do right by immigrants, but still, despite our best intentions, adopt that kind of good versus bad mentality, and are trying to build our immigration system around it. And think that we're going to achieve justice, when all we're going to do, and what history shows is that what we're going to do is build a bigger deportation machine if we believe that there are some group of people out there for whom deportation is justified.
I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage folks to use the Ask a Question button that you can see right diagonally down and to the right of the big green button to buy Alina's book, which you should also click. I will be looking at those in a second. I'm now going to turn on the light in my apartment because I didn't plan this very well. But actually, while I do that, Alina, can you talk a little bit, maybe vamp about what's a recent win that you and your team have had that you want to take a minute to brag about?
A win? Well, that's really hard. I have to say the most recent win, again, was in collaboration with other organizations, Make the Road New York, Brooklyn Defender Services. We were able to get one of our clients out of immigration jail because he was medically vulnerable to COVID-19, and to get him back with his family. It felt like a pretty big win because he was also an individual who was a target of a very violent ICE raid in his home. He was tased many times, 20 times, and they actually created the medical vulnerability that was now putting his life at risk given COVID-19. And I think, it was a victory because all of these feel like victories when ICE comes and tries to take someone away. We've seen it happen so quickly that it's really hard to find a way to fight. But it was also a victory because the city, I don't mean to be too negative on the city. The city has an incredible city council, and many people, organizations and communities really stood up and fought back, because even before this pandemic, ICE has been a public safety risk. Like ICE and immigration enforcement knocking on someone's door in the middle of the night and telling them you're the police and asking them to come out, and then handcuffing them and snatching them away into a jail. That is a violent event. And I think one downside, in a way, of ICE just continuing its level of violence is that people forget that. I think if there's one other thing I want my book to do is to just remind people that what deportation is. We have treated it, we've normalized it, and Trump has done a good job of normalizing it in many ways. But it didn't start with him, and it's been there for a long time, and people have forgotten. It's being deported is it's like getting an eviction notice, losing your job, getting divorced, having your kids taken away from you, and being sent to a place where you might be persecuted or tortured, all wrapped up in one administrative order that is given to you without the right to counsel, and maybe not even by a judge. And we do all of those things in the name of a civil legal system where, it's a bureaucracy, basically. We do that, and we don't even question it. And so I think if people can focus on the harm that deportation does, that it makes everyone less safe, whether it is the person who's gotten deported or the families that they've left behind, maybe we'll be able to have a better conversation and move conversations about victories away from, saving one person from something that should have never happened to him to really changing the system as a whole.
So I'm going to have to click through to actually see who's asking these questions so that I can attribute them appropriately. But Alina asked, first of all, how is the criminal, non-criminal, or violent, non-violent paradigm playing out in the litigation to free people from detention because of COVID-19?
Yeah, so this is a big problem. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this because you've come to this book talk. But obviously, even as there's been progress in how we talk about the racist nature and problems of the criminal legal system, there still is a divide in when we talk about folks in prison, in jails, those who deserve their quote unquote second chance based on whether or not they've committed a violent or non-violent offense. And that problem is always amplified. Adding immigration on top of the criminal legal system just amplifies the flaws in both systems. So you see the same thing happening in immigration. And I should pause to note, one of the reasons it bothers many of us who work with folks who are facing this idea of the violent versus non-violent divide is that, again, it ignores the fact, if you care about violence, if you think violence is wrong, then you should be the first person standing up asking for prisons and jails to be abolished, right? Prisons and jails do not solve violence, they just concentrate it and they make it worse. And they harm the families of people who are left behind, and they create cycles where we're never able to actually move past the harms that have been done, and we just perpetuate them. So that's my quick talk about violence versus nonviolence. In the immigration system, we're seeing this play out too, right? So it still boggles my mind, again, over 30,000 people locked up any given night in jails. The number has been higher under this administration, 50,000. The only reason it's lower is because the Trump administration has blocked asylum seekers from coming in the country when they used to be locking them up too. But it's been lowered. And so we have 30,000 people any given night who are locked up in jails. And ICE refuses to release them by saying that they're public safety risks. And they do in their press releases, in their statements to the media. They will pick the case of somebody who has a violent conviction on their record. They will use the most egregious circumstances. Dara, I know you have a great piece from last year where you talk about how Trump's favorite line is the immigrants are coming over the borders to kill you. They have this stump speech down very pat, and they will pick out cases to highlight their points. And I think because of that, obviously ICE, but also courts, when we've gone to court, they bought into this as well. Instead of actually asking, does it make sense to lock up a person because they lack paperwork in a jail where they are at significantly heightened risk of dying because of their paperwork? Does that make sense? Is that the right thing for us to do under our constitutional protections, under our systems of law? Is that the right thing to do? Or should we be debating?
Oh no.
Hey, Alina, could you try and refresh your browser? Your screen has frozen. This is where we hope that she can hear me. We do have some great questions in the question box there too.
Yeah.
I am going to email her and make sure everything's okay. I'll be right back. I'll be here, everybody.
Sorry about this, folks. Thank you for bearing with us.
Dana, if you want to plug your side of things, your podcast. Oh, it looks like Alina has there we go. Looks like she's refreshing.
To whoever asked about a feline intermission, my cat is currently sleeping on the other side of the couch, so she hasn't decided to show up yet.
To anybody asking, this will be recorded. It'll live. The recording of this event will be available at this link just a few moments after the broadcast tonight.
Getting this part?
Even this part. Pretty fun. All right, I just shot her a text. Yeah, Andrea in the chat is asking a great question. Dara, what did you think about the book?
I'm always moderately embarrassed when I read immigration books that actually like teach me something,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest. And you know, in addition to obviously so many of Alina's stories are grounded in like what she's seen through the eyes of her clients and getting these very, you know, the kind of determination to present these as complete people, and to profile them rather than just talking about, you know, the reason that they're in the book being their involvement with the criminal and immigration systems. Like some of the history in there was I think particularly just, it wasn't something that I've had the opportunity to think about in a thick way, because if you look at legislative history, you tend to see issues once they've already been in the public consciousness. And so to think about, you know, what happens before something becomes enough of a national priority that Congress is talking about it, or even that states are talking about it, the kind of ideological and social process that has an interplay with that policy is always, it's always refreshing to kind of read things that have a feet in both worlds, that don't think of politics as just what's being said in mass media, but also don't think of it as just what's in the law book.
Certainly, absolutely. Alina, we're just talking about you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, sorry for the technical difficulty. Okay, let me see. Are you getting an echo?
No.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I had to switch to my phone because my internet cut out. I guess this is the way we live these days in this new world.
And so maybe getting to another question, Vanessa wanted to hear you address the criminalization of asylum seekers by administrative rather than legislative means.
Sure. So I think this has been a particular hallmark of the Trump administration, although certainly if you go back to the 1996 laws, which is where a lot of the modern day criminalization provisions come from, which are laws signed under the Clinton administration, you start to see more of this criminalization of asylum seekers. And you're certainly seeing it here today. Obviously, the biggest change is what's happening right now, which is that people aren't being allowed to come in at all. But even before that, people being locked up in jails, whole families, was significant, as well as what we've been seeing for a long time, which is really the criminalization of people through the federal criminal system. And that's something that, again, I talk a bit about it in my book. It's also been covered, I think, thanks in part to the presidential race. There have been a lot of the candidates who've actually been willing to talk about the criminalization of migration itself and the role that it plays for people who are trying to seek asylum, that people have a better understanding. But essentially, we were talking about the national origin quotas in the 1920s, when people were prevented from coming to the U.S. based on what country they were from and really their race. There was a compromise that was reached that allowed people in the Western Hemisphere to still come, not part of those quotas. And that was something that some agricultural businesses wanted, so that Mexican and Central American people could come to the U.S. and work on farms. And that didn't sit well with the xenophobes and the eugenicists who pushed for the quota laws. And so in 1929, a segregationist senator came up with a compromise to criminalize migration. And that way, when you didn't want an immigrant, in your community anymore, when you're ready to stop immigration at a particular time, you could actually lock people up on criminal charges. And so before 1929, this wasn't criminalized at all. There were some civil requirements and violations, but it wouldn't cause you to end up locked up in prison. So that has been around on the books for a long time. It had a dramatic effect on the prison system. Kelly Hernandez talks a lot about this in the great work that she's done. And we've seen that become more the fore recently in the 1990s, 2000s. The Obama administration really expanded this. And there's a whole program called Operation Streamline the Trump administration has adopted throughout the Southwest border, where people are prosecuted in groups of 70. When I went to observe one of these horrific hearings, you're literally seeing people shuffling into a room, their legs chained together, and their hands are only to the point where they can put on a headset so they can hear a transmission of a judge talking to them all together, telling them they're facing criminal charges and asking them how they plead. I mean, for people who traveled so far just to have a chance at a better life, to seek protection, to be treated this way. And then by that point, all they want is freedom. And so they give up the very fundamental rights that asylum is designed to protect. And so that's just one of the many ways in which we've seen a significant criminalization of asylum seekers at the border.
Apologies to everyone who has noted the sound quality issues. Politics and Prose is trying to address that on their end. We'll see what we can do.
Sorry.
So Annette asks, is there a particular organization or website? Oh, sorry. Should we be?
No, you're totally fine. Alina, if you potentially have like a headphones or like a headset at hand, that might solve the sound problem. But if not, we've only got time for a couple more questions anyway.
All right. Let me see.
So sorry.
Hold on.
Okay.
Let me see if I can.
No worries. Fabulous.
See if this works.
I'm gonna go away again.
So finishing the question, Annette asked, is there a particular organization or website that can advise voters nationwide as to against immigrant rights? It's definitely not a question that I can answer for reasons of journalistic objectivity. But
sorry, first let me check. Is this better?
Yes, so much.
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that. The cliff notes on my prior answer was related to Operation Streamline. So hopefully you all will have a chance to learn more about that if you don't already know about how horrible it is. But sorry, Dara, you were asking about organizations?
Yeah, or a website that can advise people about the immigration, of politicians' immigration stances.
Oh, politicians' immigration stances. So that's a great question. The places that I've always gone to get the best information about different policies and ways that people can get involved in fighting back against criminalization include the Detention Watch Network. They have a website that contains a lot of current campaigns that communities are pursuing, as well as the Immigrant Defense Project, which has a specialization around criminalization. So I definitely plug those places as ways to learn more about what communities are asking for. In terms of politicians, we're at a moment now where the field has narrowed and the platforms of our two competitors are not what they should be, but there is room for growth and, on one side. And so there are groups right now that are trying to gather and collect the best practices and what people are hoping, and particularly from the Biden camp, what we're hoping that he may adopt. And so there are a couple of different platforms around migrant justice and migrant freedom that people are advocating for. And so I would look to those. And I know that several of the groups, whether it's United We Dream, Detention Watch Network, and others, participate in coming up with those platforms. And the National Immigrant Justice Center is another organization that has thought a lot about what a national platform should look like. So I would recommend going there.
The last question for us is, it kind of ties into the closing, or kind of kicks it back to politics and prose a little bit. Are you aware of other books on immigration that you would recommend? It mentions Adam Goodman's The Deportation Machine, which I admit I have a e-copy of and I haven't read yet. I feel like this was the spring for a lot of very deeply historically informed immigration books. But what other recommendations would you make book-wise for people who want to learn more?
Well, there is a book coming out this month by John Washington called The Dispossessed, and it focuses on asylum, which I know is of interest from what I could tell from the chat screen from many people who might be watching. So I definitely recommend that. I just was having a conversation today with Erica Lee, who wrote a history of xenophobia called America for Americans. And I think that's a great book to read. And there's Migrating to Prison, which is specifically about abolishing immigration detention, the immigration jail and prison system. So those are some of the books that I would recommend. There's really a wealth of information out there. Hopefully that will create a blueprint for change for future administrations. Oh, and of course, all of your writing. I was telling Dara earlier that we regularly quote and cite her articles in all of our federal lawsuits because she gets the information first. So thank you for everything you do to expose what the administration is doing.
Just trying to keep on top of everything.
It's a hard job.
Thank you both so much for this conversation and for sticking with it. And thank you everybody for staying with us tonight through this excellent conversation, even with the technical difficulties. I have one last question for you both, and that's, what are you reading during this time?
I'm a little bit between books right now. I had not read any of the Wolf Hall trilogy by Hilary Mantel and devoured it in like 10 days.
Awesome.
Which was probably too fast because now I feel like I want to take a while before starting anything else, because it was just really excellent fiction world building and writing.
Well, I got an advanced copy of The Dispossessed, so I'm working through that now, which is great. And sadly, reading a lot of court decisions, good and bad. Hoping to see more good over the next few weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. Again, this was really, really excellent and definitely very timely. We know the situation at prisons, especially with people wrongfully imprisoned, is exacerbated by these times. And thank you to everybody in our audience. Again, your patronage is what's letting us bring you this programming. It's what's keeping our doors open. A independent small business like us really cannot continue functioning without the book sales to keep us open. So hit that big green button at the bottom and buy this very excellent book, No Justice in the Shadows by Alina Das. Thank you so much for being here. You can also hit the follow button up at the top near the Politics and Prose logo to be notified of our future crowdcasts. And we thank you so much. We hope you stay well. We hope you stay safe, and we hope you stay well read. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, and thanks for bearing with the technical difficulties. It was really great to be in conversation with all of you.
Definitely. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.